Tom stood outside the exam room, holding his ticket tightly. His hands were shaking, and his heart was racing. He looked at the other candidates, who seemed confident and calm. Tom felt nervous and unsure of himself. This exam could change his life. He took a deep breath, trying to calm down. He knew this was his chance to become a teacher. It was his dream, and he had worked hard for it. But the pressure was heavy on his shoulders. Failure was not an option. He thought about his son Max. Max was his reason to fight. Tom wanted to give him a better future. He remembered all the struggles they faced together, all the late nights studying and the long days working. He had to pass this exam, no matter what. The door to the exam room opened. A voice called his name. Tom's heart skipped a beat. It was time to face his challenge. He took another deep breath. He walked in, his hands still shaking. The exam was about to begin. The night before the exam, Tom could not sleep. He sat at the small table, surrounded by books and papers. His eyes were tired, but he kept reading. He had to memorize everything. There was no time to rest. Max was sleeping on the old sofa. Tom watched him for a moment. His son looked so peaceful. Tom felt a mix of love and responsibility. He had to succeed for Max. He went back to his notes, fighting against sleep. His hands were shaking from exhaustion. The words on the page started to blur. He couldn't afford to fail. He needed this job. It was his only way out of poverty. As the clock showed 3 a.m., Tom's body begged for rest, but his mind was determined. He took a deep breath and continued studying. Tomorrow was the exam. He had to be ready, no matter how tired he was. Tom sat at the desk, staring at the exam paper. His hands were cold and sweaty. The room was silent, but his heart was loud. It was beating fast with anxiety. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. The questions looked difficult. Tom's mind went blank for a moment. Panic started to rise inside him. He remembered all the nights he studied. He needed to focus. This was his chance. He couldn't waste it. He looked around the room. Other students were writing quickly. They looked confident. Tom felt small and scared. He wondered if he was good enough. But then, he remembered Max's face. His son needed him to succeed. Tom closed his eyes for a second. He whispered, "I can do this." He held the pencil tightly and started to write. The first words were difficult, but he kept going. He would not give up. Not today, not ever. Tom remembered the day they received the eviction notice. It was raining heavily outside. The letter was wet, but the words were clear. They had to leave the house. Tom's heart sank as he read it. Max was playing with an old toy. He looked up and asked, "Are we moving, Dad?" Tom forced a smile and said, "Yes, we are." They had nowhere to go. No money for rent. Tom went to the landlord and begged for more time. He explained his situation, but the landlord refused. He said, "Pay by the end of the month or leave." Tom felt hopeless. He didn't know what to do. That night, Tom held Max close. He promised him they would be okay, but his heart was heavy with fear. He needed a solution. He needed a job that paid more. And that's when he decided to become a teacher. Tom worked long hours every day. He washed cars under the hot sun. His back hurt, and his hands were rough. But he never complained. He needed the money for Max. He had no choice. After work, Tom was always tired. But he didn't rest. He went home and studied. His eyes were heavy, but he kept reading. He wanted a better life. He needed to pass the exam. While washing cars, Tom watched people in suits. They looked important and successful. He dreamed of being like them one day. He wanted respect. He wanted stability for Max. Sometimes, Tom felt hopeless. The road was too hard and the dream seemed far away. But he remembered his promise to Max. He couldn't give up. He kept working and studying, day after day. Tom remembered his first job interview. He wore his best shirt, even though it was old and worn. He was nervous, but hopeful. This job could change everything. He needed it desperately. The interviewer looked at his resume and frowned. "You don't have a degree," he said. Tom's heart sank. He tried to explain his hard work and dedication. But the man shook his head. "We need qualified people." Tom felt embarrassed and small. He left the office with heavy shoulders. It was painful to face rejection. He felt like a failure, but he knew he had to keep trying. Max was counting on him. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the interview. The word "no" echoed in his head, but he couldn't give up. He decided to learn more and get a degree. He would prove them wrong. Tom stood outside the community center. A poster on the wall said, "Night classes available." He looked at it carefully. It was his chance to get an education. He needed this to be a teacher. His hands were shaking as he picked up the form. It was a big decision. Studying meant less time to work. It meant less money for food and rent. But it also meant hope. It meant a future for Max. Tom took a deep breath and filled out the form. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Balancing work, studies, and being a father was a huge challenge. But he was ready to fight. He had no other choice. He looked at Max, who was smiling innocently. Tom's heart was full of love and responsibility. He would do anything to give his son a better life, even if it meant sleepless nights and endless struggles. Tom entered the classroom nervously. He looked around and saw younger students. They were full of energy and confidence. Tom felt old and out of place. His hands were shaking again. He sat at the back, hoping no one would notice him. The teacher began the lesson. Tom tried to follow along, but it was difficult. He hadn't studied in years. Everything felt new and confusing. During the break, he heard students talking about their dreams. They were excited about the future. Tom felt a pang of doubt. Was he too late? Could he really do this? But then he remembered Max's face. He couldn't give up. He took a deep breath and opened his book. He would learn, no matter how hard it was. He was here to fight for his future. After long days of work, Tom would study late into the night. His eyes were heavy, and his body was tired. But he forced himself to keep going. He had no time to waste. Max would sleep on the sofa nearby. Sometimes he would wake up and see Tom with his books. "Why don't you sleep, Dad?" Max would ask. Tom smiled and said, "I'm learning to be a teacher." Tom drank cheap coffee to stay awake. His hands would shake from exhaustion. But he knew he couldn't stop. Every page he read was one step closer to his dream. Sometimes, the words didn't make sense. His mind was too tired, but he read them again and again until he understood. It was hard, but Tom refused to quit. He was determined to pass the exams. There were days when Tom felt hopeless. He failed a test once. The paper was covered in red marks. His heart sank. He felt stupid and defeated. Maybe he wasn't good enough. He looked at his classmates. They were younger and smarter. They understood everything quickly. Tom felt old and slow. He wondered if he was wasting his time. The doubt was heavy. One evening he sat alone, staring at his books. He thought about quitting. It seemed easier to give up. The pain of failure was too much. But then, he heard Max's voice. "Don't give up, Dad." Tears filled Tom's eyes. Max believed in him. He wiped his tears and picked up the book again. He would fight. even if it was hard. He would keep his promise. One evening after class, Tom stayed behind. He was struggling with the homework. The numbers and words didn't make sense. He felt lost and frustrated. He almost gave up. The teacher noticed Tom's struggle. He approached and asked, "Do you need help?" Tom hesitated, but then nodded. He was ashamed, but he needed to learn. The teacher sat next to him and explained patiently. He showed Tom how to solve the problems step by step. For the first time, Tom understood. A small light of hope appeared. From then on, the teacher helped him after class. Tom studied harder and started to improve. He wasn't alone anymore. Someone believed in him. It gave him strength to keep going. Tom's life became even harder. Balancing work and studies was exhausting. At night, he studied until he fell asleep. One day, Tom was late for work. His boss was angry. "If you're late again, you're fired," he shouted. Tom tried to explain about his classes, but the boss didn't care. Tom was scared. He needed the job to support Max. But he also needed his education to change their future. He was stuck between two hard choices. It felt impossible to balance both. He went home that night, tired and worried. Tom looked at his son and knew he couldn't quit. He had to find a way. He had to be strong for Max. After years of hard work, the final exam was here. Tom was nervous. This test would decide if he could graduate. He studied day and night to prepare. Everything depended on this moment. He entered the classroom and sat down. His heart was beating fast. He remembered all the struggles he faced. All the nights he stayed awake. This was his chance to prove himself. The exam was difficult. Tom's hands were shaking. But he focused and wrote everything he learned. He remembered his teacher's words and used them to solve the problems. He didn't give up. When he finished, he felt exhausted. He handed in the paper with a shaky hand. Now he could only wait. The result would decide his future. He prayed for the best. Weeks later, Tom received the result. He passed the exam. Tears filled his eyes as he read the paper. He did it. He finally graduated. He was educated. At the graduation ceremony, Tom felt proud. He wore the cap and gown. It was the first time he felt important. He saw Max smiling in the crowd. His heart was full of joy. Tom walked on stage to receive his diploma. His hands were shaking, but this time from happiness. He held the paper tightly. It was more than a diploma. It was his ticket to a better future. After the ceremony, he hugged Max tightly. "We did it," he whispered. Max laughed and said, "I knew you could do it, Dad." Tom's heart was full. He finally believed in himself. Back in the exam room, Tom was still nervous. But now he felt stronger. He remembered his journey. All the sacrifices he made. All the pain and struggle. He was ready to fight. He looked at the exam paper. The questions were hard, but he didn't panic. Tom took a deep breath and started writing. His hand was steady. He remembered his teacher's lessons. He remembered the late nights studying. He was confident this time. The clock was ticking. Time was running out. But Tom kept writing. He wrote until the last second. When the exam ended, he felt relieved. Whatever the result, he gave his best. After the exam, Tom felt anxious. Doubts filled his mind. Did I write the right answers? Was I good enough? He started to panic. His hands were shaking. He left the exam room and sat on a bench outside. He felt dizzy. His thoughts were loud and negative. You failed. You will never succeed. Tom covered his face with his hands. He wanted to cry, but he held back the tears. He felt lost and scared. All his efforts, all his sacrifices. Was it all for nothing? The fear of failure was heavy on his heart. Tom took a deep breath. He had to stay strong. He wiped his face and stood up. Tom walked slowly towards home. On the way, he remembered Max's words. "I want to be like you, Dad." Those words gave him hope. "You are smart, Tom. You just need a chance." Those words echoed in his mind. Someone believed in him. That made him believe in himself. With each memory, Tom felt stronger. The fear and doubt began to fade. He realized he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for Max. He was fighting for their future. The day of the results finally arrived. Tom was nervous. He went to the school's notice board. His eyes moved quickly, searching for his name. He felt his heart drop. His name wasn't there. Panic started to rise. But then he saw it, at the bottom of the list. Tom Miller, passed. Tom stared at his name, unable to believe it. His hands were shaking again, but this time with joy. He passed. After all the struggles, he made it. He felt a wave of relief and happiness. Tears filled his eyes. He remembered Max's face. He remembered his promise. Tom took a deep breath. This was the start of a new life. Tom rushed home to share the news. Max was playing with his old toys. When he saw Tom, he ran to him and hugged him. Tom lifted Max up and spun him around, laughing. "I passed, Max, I did it," Tom said with tears in his eyes. Max's face lit up. "I knew you would, Dad." They hugged tightly. It was a moment of pure joy and love. Tom had no money for a big party, but they were happy. They laughed and talked about the future. Max was proud of his dad. Tom looked at his son and felt complete. All the pain, all the struggles, it was worth it. He kept his promise. He gave Max hope, and he gave himself a new beginning. The first day of Tom's new job arrived. He stood in front of the classroom, wearing a suit. It was old but clean. He was nervous but excited. This was his dream coming true. The students looked at him curiously. Tom smiled and introduced himself. "I am Mr. Miller, your new teacher." The words felt surreal. He couldn't believe he made it this far. He started the lesson, remembering all his studies and his teacher's help. He used the same patience his teacher showed him. The students listened. They were engaged and curious. After class, Tom sat at his desk and looked around the empty room. He took a deep breath and smiled. He did it. He was finally a teacher. And it was just the beginning.